6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast. I'm your host, Jackson. Now, before I start telling you about this episode, please, if you enjoy the content that we create here at History with Jackson, please do leave a rating and a review. It really helps the podcast grow and helps people understand what we're all about. Now, today's episode is with Steve Tibble, who's a historian and author, and we are talking about his book, Templars, The Knights Who Made Britain, that has recently come out with Yale University Press. Now, Steve is an awesome guest. He really drives into the story of who the British Knights Templar were, their purpose, their role, and I know you're going to enjoy listening to myself and Steve have a conversation about these mysterious figures. And he will also correct a few misconceptions that you might have about this awesome order. Now, without further ado, I will leave you with Steve. So hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. Today we're talking to author and historian and just all-round great guy, Steve Tibble, about his brand new book with Yale University Press, Templars. I have got a copy here, Templars, The Knights Who Made Britain. How you doing, Steve?
Oh, very good, and lovely to be talking to you, Jackson.
I'm really excited to have you on the podcast, and I know I've said it to you, in phone calls or in person, but I really enjoyed your book, and I'm looking forward to talking about it, so our listeners can find out more about the Templars.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm really pleased you enjoyed it. I tried to make it accessible, and there's such a crazy group of guys that it's hard not to get immersed in it. I find anyway. So I'm really glad that you got something out of it.
Well, like you said, when it's so accessible, but you really get a feeling for the Templars and you start to feel for the characters that are in your book. But I want to ask you one question. I like to ask this to all the guests who come on the podcast. What inspired you to write this book?
I think that the underlying reason I write about the Crusades is I'm permanently in awe of them. Really, because I think you and I have such comfortable lives. Well, maybe you don't have such a comfortable life because you play rugby and get broken bones, which I carefully don't do. But, I have healthcare, we've got the NHS, I've got life insurance, I've got a sofa. I've got all the luxuries, and I lead, a very safe, comfortable life. And I'm in awe of people who wake up in the morning, have very few resources, and yet through focus and determination and bravery are able to do great things. So certainly with the Crusades, and it's this is true for all the people who were fighting in the Crusades. I'm not just talking about the European Crusaders. These were people who achieved huge things with almost nothing, almost no resources. So I'm permanently in awe of them, not because I can relate to them, but because I know I couldn't do what they do. And in a way, I found the Templars are a bit of they're almost a sublime part of that. They're guys on the extreme. If you take the normal Crusaders who are doing quite, heavily focused stuff and achieving great things, the Templars are even more so. They're like a refined version of what that period of history is like to me. And they still loom so large in our popular imagination and our memory, our folk memory, that you'd think there were tens of thousands of them. In fact, there were very few. There were just a few hundred out fighting in the Middle East at any given point. And the impact that this tiny group of people had, I just find, totally awesome. And I find it inspirational that, even someone like me, I can actually get up in the morning and achieve a few things. And you look at what they did and you go, oh my God, I just can't. How can you compete with that? But it is actually, I find it uplifting. You don't have to agree with everything they tried to do, but it's just what the human spirit can achieve in whatever direction it aims itself is astounding, I think.
I totally agree. They are just awesome. And I couldn't, like you, I couldn't imagine doing half the things that they even do. So it's great to read their story and learn more about them. But we're talking about the Templars, but your book's about the British Templars. So I want to ask you, who were the Templars? Because we have this image, like you said, of there being thousands and thousands of knights. And more specifically, who were the British Knights Templars?
Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right, Jackson. So the book focuses on Britain, partly because I'm British, and so it's sort of it's an area that's close to home, literally. As as I'm speaking to you now, I'm walking distance from one Templar preceptory, and when I'm where I'm going to be on Monday, I'm going to be walking distance from their headquarters. So they have a presence in Britain. They still have a ghostly presence, pretty much every part of England, particularly England, Scotland, and Wales. Less so. Sorry, England, Scotland, and Ireland. Less so in Wales, but they still have a presence. They have a material presence. The other way that I wanted to take the story was to show how the British Templars were effectively a kind of case study for how the Templars worked in a broader sense. Because I think certainly when I was a student, I assumed the Templars were just a few guys fighting out in the Middle East, primarily French. It was kind of, it's not 100% untrue, but it's way, way off the real truth. And to me, one of the beautiful things about the Templars was they had this fabulous clarity of purpose. They had a very almost sublime strategy that allowed them to carry out with very few resources great things over 200 years. And they had a kind of corporate memory and a corporate strategy that I think any organization would be proud to have, much better than a lot of our current governments, for instance, who've got huge resources and just messed it all up. To me, the key division in the Templar strategy was, if you think there's a central point, and the central point is they exist to help the papacy and Christendom as a whole defend the Christian communities of the Middle East. So that's the objective, defending the Christian Middle East. Within that, the Templars split into two parts. There's the sort of standing army, and those lads that are garrisoned in the Middle East. They're in what we now currently call Israel, Lebanon, Turkey, bits of Syria, Jordan, and so on. And they're manning castles. They're in the front of the charges. They're doing all the kind of hard, glamorous, real sharp tip of the spear stuff that they're famous for. But that is literally just one half. The other half is what they do in the West. So there's kind of an Eastern strategy, which is basically a kind of multinational standing army. So there's French guys there, but there's also people from all over Europe, including a lot of Brits fighting out there. And in the West, every part of Western Europe by and large, has a Templar presence. And in that presence, they try to do what they can peacefully for the crusading movement. So they're trying to persuade kings to go on crusade. They're trying to gather donations of land so they can raise cash crops and send money to pay for mercenaries. They're ingratiating themselves with governments, trying to make governments more productive and more stable, not because they're Mother Teresa or anything. They're not doing this for altruistic reasons. They're doing it because they want to be trusted and they want to be given lots of money. And with that money, they can again try and achieve that corporate objective. So you've got these two very different sub-strands of the strategy, which is peace in the West and war in the East. But both parts of them work harmoniously together to achieve the ultimate objective, which is to fight for the Christian communities in the Middle East. And the British Templars, to me, are a very good example of this. So what I tried to do in the book is look at the British Templars in the round. So we try and follow the careers of the British Templar soldiers fighting out in the Holy Land, what they got up to. We don't know a huge amount about them, and as individuals, it's often difficult to see. But we get glimpses into the quite huge, almost, it's like science fiction, some of the stuff. You find, Brits end up running most of the standing army in Lebanon, for instance, and nearly killing Saladin's predecessor. So wild stuff happening out over there. And at the same time, you try and focus on what the British Templars are doing in Britain. So they're advisors to kings, they're lobbyists, they're inventing investment banking, which may or may not be a good thing, but they certainly used it to good effect. They're accountants, they're administrators, they're at the heart of agriculture. So it's that combination of two different sets of great skills working harmoniously. And I find it awesome, really. It's just how people with so few resources can do so much.
It's really, I thought, reading through it, it's really ahead of their time, actually, to have those two split strategies. and very corporate way of thinking. We have this strategy in these spaces, and we're doing, what modern businesses do today with governments, and we have this separate strategy out in the East. It was really interesting to see those
Yeah,
dynamics play out and how they supported one another. But
yeah.
how were the Templars set up? How did they come into being then?
We have to go back to the First Crusade. You're absolutely right. The foundation actually tells the whole story. Really, if you think back to the First Crusade, so it's a heavily armed pilgrimage, really, and the guys go off in huge numbers to try and offer help to the old ancient Christian communities of the Holy Land. And actually, the majority, we tend to forget, the majority of the population of that part of the Middle East was still Christian in the 12th and 13th century. So it's not that they were totally invading a Muslim country. The majority of the population was still Christian. The First Crusade arrived, and probably against the odds. Really, I think it was quite. They were helped by lucky circumstances, but they also fought incredibly well, incredibly bravely. They did actually make it through, and they did capture Jerusalem, and that was a real turning point. And I think for a lot of the guys, people thought, "Oh, brilliant! That's great! We can, yeah, job done. I'm off." And the majority of them did go back very soon afterwards because they thought of it as a pilgrimage. And if you think of it, that's what a pilgrimage is. You go somewhere, you make your presence known, and then job done. You go home, see your wife you haven't seen for 5 years or whatever. But depending on how you interpret a crusade, you could argue that is just the beginning. It's not the end. And so you had, so the Crusaders effectively divided into two. There were the people who thought it was job done, it's over, and the people who thought the job's just starting. Because the key thing is that Jerusalem, which is the epicenter of Christian belief, is almost entirely indefensible. It's an inland city. It's underpopulated. It's got problems with food and water. It's a nightmare from a military point of view. So what you had when most of the lads went home was you had a tiny group of guys who'd achieved far too much, and they had this kind of liability. So now this tiny group of effectively leftover soldiers have got the liability of protecting and defending the Holy Land, and particularly Jerusalem, which is an absolute nightmare. And at the time, people struggled with how you do that, and they set up different Crusader States, which did their best. But these were very poor, very underpopulated sort of kingdoms. So what in effect happened was that the papacy stepped in and started to create ways in which resources could be channeled from the west towards the east. And again, there's a kind of beauty about that strategy, which I find very attractive. And the Templars were at the forepoint of that. Effectively, they were just a few guys, no more than a dozen, 9, 10 dozen men, who in effect were the kind of bouncers. They were the security team for the Holy Sepulchre because there were a lot of holy relics there. And the guys started off in a very, very small way, but it became clear that was the germ of a very good idea. And that idea was, how on earth do we channel resources from the kingdoms of the West, which are always going to be kind of selfish, inward looking. Every king has got something better to do than to go off to the Middle East, to someplace. It's almost like, for us, it'd be like traveling to the moon. It's such an outlandish thing to do. It's like, how can we get resources out of a very unproductive West and transport it and convert it into troops for the East? And the Templars were a way of doing that right from the beginning. So having Templar recruits and volunteers was a way of getting men to go back out there, and having the Templars working closely with kings and princes in the West was a way of getting sort of money out there as well. And the combination of those two things, men and material, was what it needed. And I think you made a very good point earlier, and that is the modernity. The idea is so far ahead of its time. If you think of the current situation, so the EU still hasn't been able to get its act together to have a common military presence or a common foreign policy or any common way in which they can express policy or force. So there is, even now, there's no, we can't manage that kind of multinational force. So it was a huge step forward that in such a fragmented, low productive economy world, they managed to produce a multinational standing army for a place that was so far away, it might as well have been on the moon. And similarly, they invented, as they went along, what was effectively a kind of multinational, multi-professional services organization in the West. You have the accountants, you've got the lawyers, you've got the lobbyists, you've got all the kind of investment bankers, modern professional services in one bundle. And obviously it's very embryonic, but again, it is just such a strange, beautiful symmetry and so ahead of its time that I just find it incredibly exciting, really.
And it's really interesting to see those services develop because they see a need for them. But how does this I'm trying to understand, how does it go from being an organization of 10, 12 people guarding some holy relics to this multinational corporation with lobbyists, lawyers, doctors, and a standing army?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the key point happened very, very quickly. In the 1120s, the kings of Jerusalem were trying to recover Damascus. Damascus used to be a Christian city. It had been captured by the Muslims from the 7th century, and had been taken over by the Turks in the 11th century. So the kings of Jerusalem wanted to try and recover Damascus, because I think they understood. They had a very good sense of strategy as well, which we never give them credit for, but that's maybe another conversation. But they realized that if they were going to survive, they had to have some kind of defense in depth, and they had to have big population centers. Because if you look at the Crusader States, we look at them, we look at them in minute detail, but in fact, they're just this kind of thin strip that's hanging on the edge of a massive set of Islamic states and empires. So they're really indefensible over the long term, unless you can kind of break into the hinterland and get some big population centers. So they were trying to recapture Damascus. And the way that they wanted to do that was to get help from the Byzantines, which was great, the Orthodox Christians. So they'd send out embassies for that. But they also wanted to get help from the West. So the kings of Jerusalem sent out embassies to the West, and the embryonic Templars were sent out to accompany that kind of diplomatic mission, and they had a little mission of their own. And they actually went off recruiting, lobbying, and they were incredibly attractive. I mean, as an iconic group, it was clear that there was just a little bit. It's like Shakespeare, there was magic in the air when they got there. They were so unusual that they were a religious order, but they were also military. These were tough, big, muscular guys who, for the first time, the kings and the princes could relate to. So the upper classes, the guys with money in Europe, could really relate to these people. So these people, by and large, most people were pious in the world in those days, but most people also had quite muscular lives. And for the kings and the secular people of Europe, this was a huge wake-up call. And for the first time, they had an opportunity to participate in the Crusades over the longer term in a way that was very attractive. They could be pious, they could be part of a religious order, but they also could be chivalrous. They could show their military skills. They could be comrades in arms. There was a lot that was very attractive there. So when the Templars did this initial kind of lobbying mission, it was hugely successful, and they raised lots of recruits. They raised lots of money, and certainly in England and Scotland in particular, they were instantly became a big hit. They were great advisors to King David in Scotland, and really ingratiated themselves with the English crown. Started getting lots of estates. Lots of people volunteered for the cause. And even in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, you can see there are a lot of people joining this Damascus adventure. As they don't mention the Templars by name, but we know that the Templars were there doing their work as well. And it was from that point that it all really took off, and the logic stayed with it after that.
I mean, I can certainly see the attraction. If there's something that you can relate to, why not? Why not be involved in it? But I kind of want to, your book's mainly about the British Templars, so I want to refocus onto the British part of the organisation. England is not particularly. I think I'm being generous now to England. England was not politically stable at this point, You have a lot of succession issues over mighty barons and nobilities. How does the order kind of operate and seek to keep itself going within the period called the Anarchy, and then again afterwards in a more stable period during Henry II's reign?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a challenge, definitely a challenge. But the order created a template in the Anarchy, which I think worked very well. And the template went back to their core strategy, really, which is, in the West, we're the stabilizing influence. And again, not because we're, too altruistic, it's because that is the best way forward for everyone. So during the Anarchy, they actually worked well with both sides. Well, and to say both sides is probably a simplification. All sides, really. You know what it's like. The world is so fragmented then that they were very popular with the Empress Matilda and her son, and they were very generous patrons and kickstarted a lot of the Templar estates. But they were also very, very popular with Stephen and his wife, Queen Matilda, a different one, two Matildas, but the one thing that the two Matildas did have in common was they both loved the Templars. They were both substantial donors in their own right, and that's again something I tried to bring out in the book is the way in which there is, the Templars are not the most feminine of organizations. They didn't really even have female associates, but they definitely had very good working relationships with powerful female characters, and they could, they got on very well with them in certain cases. So the economic side of it was good, and the basis of that was trust. They were trustworthy. Both sides could trust them, and they could be used in civil wars. For instance, later with King John, for moving hostages, taking prisoners from one side to the other, transporting money, things that you really need high levels of trust, and both sides in a civil war were able to trust them. Having said that, it's also in the Anarchy that you see the foundations of the basic Templar strategy, which is you have to side with the existing establishment, not because you necessarily like them or because you want to go on a beach holiday with them. You can actually morally not be on their side, but you hang with them because the establishment is the only way in which a crusade could get launched. In the middle of a civil war, nobody's going to go on crusade. You need that civil war to stop as soon as possible. And once it's stopped, you want to be on the winning side. That is the establishment figure, king or queen, whether you like them or not. They're the ones you've got to work with. And you try and make their position as good as possible so they can do as much as possible for the crusading movement. So you find in reigns like King John, and personally, I find there's very little to like about King John. He was not a good man. He had his little ways. And sometimes no one spoke to him for days and days and days. And I think they kind of held their noses when they were working with people like that. But they were trusted by John, as they were by pretty much all the English kings and queens, and worked very well with them, and did things that you wouldn't necessarily expect. But if you take a step back and look at the strategy, and you realize that there is a corporate process and strategy here that is in place for 200 years, it's hugely impressive. And you have to keep reminding yourself that's what they're doing. It's not about individuals, it's not about families, it's about this corporate view and how that impressively rolls out for centuries.
It's really impressive to see even through Stephen and Henry, that they always have that singular goal in mind to work on those Crusader states, to work in the Crusades. And it's really impressive to see when Europe doesn't particularly have very clear, coherent goals that one organization does. But the successor to Henry II, Richard I, is a huge figure in crusading, and he's probably the thing he's known for here in England. How do the British Templars support Richard in his crusading efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Richard is, in some ways, it's their dream come true. Yeah, or it's the dream for the British Templars. So he's the case study of how it should work. Basically, so you've supported the establishment. You're trusted by Richard's father. You're trusted by you've been trusted by everybody, and You've been in the background lobbying, you've been helping to train the troops, you've been drip feeding ideas about strategy into their ears as they're going along. And then suddenly you get this fabulous guy takes over. So just by the accident of DNA and biology, you end up with somebody in charge who not only wants to go on crusade and to support the movement, but is actually a very gifted military figure, a very gifted general. So for them, it's absolutely perfect. And you can see the whole organization, Templar organization in Britain and beyond, just kind of springs into action. And they make, well, firstly, it's hard to prove it definitively, but it's pretty obvious that they do a lot of training in the background. Because when Richard and the English troops and all his French troops get out to the Middle East, they really know what they're doing. They're operating well against Turkic light cavalry that they've never encountered in Western Europe. Clearly, that doesn't happen by accident. They're able to do a fighting march down the coast of Palestine in a very intricate formation that nobody in Europe ever uses because they don't need to, because they're not facing Turkic, mounted archers. So it's clear that they're working in the background with military advice and as well as volunteers themselves, and they provide a kind of an elite, together with the other military orders like the Hospitalers, they provide a kind of an elite cavalry unit for him as well. But above that, what you find also is that they instantly change their organizational structures to face Richard and to let him know that they're on his side. So Robert de Sablé, who's one of Richard's liege men, very powerful, noble, becomes one of Richard's admirals and leading military commanders. He's also a great diplomat. He helps negotiate in Cyprus and so on. And he becomes the Templar Grand Master. So this British Templar becomes not just head of the Master of the British Templars, he actually becomes the Grand Master of the whole order. And so he's by Richard's side, helping him all the way. And his men are there helping him all the way. So the British Templars would have gone out to the east with Richard and with their new Grand Master, and they'd have been working with Richard. And you find at the big battles, they're right up there with him, doing good work. So yeah, they just go for it hell for leather, and it's the culmination of their strategy, and it's beautiful to see it in action.
And I agree with that point. Reading through your book, it is beautiful to finally see the Templars operating at a point where they want to operate with someone who wants to operate with them. But not long after this, there's some issues with the Crusader States, and the Crusader States start to fail and start to collapse. With the Crusader States being so central to the Templars way of life, and their organizational structure, how do they try and stay relevant and important in political life, and how do they try and stay financially viable with this happening?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, obviously they're operating within a broad geopolitical context, and the Christian presence in the Middle East, as we were saying, is very much fringe. We can over exaggerate how important the Crusades were, but they were kind of a little fringe on the edge of a huge Islamic empire stretching all the way over to Afghanistan. So the Crusader States are in decline. The Templars are doing everything they can to slow down that process. So they're manning, they're building the best castles, they're manning them, they're at the forefront of battles, but they're so outnumbered by this point. You're dealing with huge armies. The Mongols suddenly start to appear. The Mamluks are there in huge force. They become, the whole of the Crusader States become a bit part player, really, in a grand play where the main reason they still survive is because their different opponents are more interested in fighting each other. They become spectators, really, which is good and bad. At least the spectator survives. So the Templars are there in their great castles, and they're doing their best, and they're fighting a lot. But ultimately, they're not really the focus of attention. So, and they carry on in the West as well. So they're trying to bring resources over, and they support crusades. For instance, Edward I, just before he became Edward I, when he was Prince Edward, came over and launched his own little crusade, and the Templars were with him, did what they could. He survived an assassination attempt, and there were stories that the Templars had advised him not to get into that position, keep the assassin at arm's length, but also that helped, even to the point of giving him medical aid afterwards, helping with the poison, cope with the poisoned knife and so on. So they were doing everything they could. But I think you quite rightly touched on the key point, which is relevance. And you do get to a point where ultimately the Templars and all of the Crusaders are so hugely outnumbered. There's only a few hundred Templars out there. You can't stop major geopolitical forces. It's, you're facing a tsunami. What can you do? You can do your best, but you're probably not going to win. You would not bet on the Crusader States to survive, and inevitably they didn't. The last big cities fell in 1291, particularly Acre, and the Templars did a huge amount, to help with defending it. But, it was unwinnable. By that point, it was an unwinnable war. The problem with the Templars, and this is where their strategy went from the sublime to the ridiculous, was that they failed to adjust. And if you were doing a kind of a business case study of the Templars, which I actually think is a very clear case study, it's the story is, in a way, there are two stories. The first story is how a small organization with a great strategy and clarity can do well. But the second story is how you need to make sure that strategy remains relevant and adapts. And that was where the Templars really fell down. They had no adaptive quality in them at the end. So when the Crusader States collapsed, they were still selling one idea. And that one idea was, we've got feet on the ground in the Middle East and we can defend the Holy Land. And that clearly was no longer true. They didn't have enough troops to do anything. They couldn't reinvade the Middle East. They'd lost the Middle East. They couldn't, they'd very visibly failed, and they refused to move with the times. So the Teutonic Knights went ahead and reinvented themselves. They had a role on the other Eastern Front, and the Hospitallers carried on fighting in Rhodes and later Malta. And also, they had other things to do as well. They were actually working with the sick, like, clues in the name. But the Templars refused to do that. They could have amalgamated with the Hospitallers, and there was powerful, overwhelming logic for it, but they were too stubborn. And I think that second corporate business case study is just as interesting. It's the cataclysmic consequences of failure to have an adaptive strategy. And I'd love to do more work on that. It's to me, it's very, very powerful.
I really like that point about the business case studies, because it kind of makes it brings it into a way that we can understand and relate to modern life. But there's 2 points that you brought out within that answer that I really want to touch on and dive into a little bit more. So the Templars are a massive force and big figures in the Middle East. How do these other empires, the Mamluks, the Ayyubids, and the Mongols, how do they see the Templars?
Yeah, in the same ways we have quite an extreme view of them. I think they did as well in some ways, quite polarized. So on the one hand, although we have a view of the Templars as being fanatical and possibly anti-Islamic, and on the ground that was not the case at all. Although they were the best fighters, but certainly from their opponent's point of view, because they'd been on the ground for so long, they knew the politics, they knew how the game played out, and they were people that you could deal with. Again, they were trusted. So by and large, if an Islamic government was negotiating with the Franks, they quite often preferred to deal with people like the Templars, because they knew how to do it, and they could generally be relied on to try and deliver. That doesn't mean they liked them, but they were people you could do business with. Whereas Crusaders, they can just be a bunch of nutters who are visiting for a few months. They're never going to know the real situation, and they're going to behave quite irrationally. So I think from an Islamic point of view, you'd rather deal with the Templars than the alternatives in the case of the Crusaders. The other thing is, I think that there was this kind of grudging respect. They were known as the best warriors of Europe, the best of the Frankish soldiers, and that again, that's not to say that there was great affection there, but there was recognition that they were great fighters. So, for instance, Saladin, who for reasons I've never understood has a reputation for being chivalrous, used to routinely murder prisoners, but the Templars and the Hospitallers were particularly singled out for quick murder, not for any particular reason other than the fact that they were so good. The one thing you didn't, and there were so few of them, so if you captured, like after the Battle of Hattin, a couple of hundred Templars and Hospitallers, you didn't want them being ransomed and coming back and facing you the next year. So he just put a line in the sand, just had them all beheaded. And similarly, you find that with the Mamluks in the 13th century, Baibars would routinely, or certainly very often, to execute Templar prisoners rather than letting them free because he didn't want to see them again. They were too dangerous.
Again, you're seeing those same kind of beliefs from Western Europe politically in the East, where they're respecting them, then they're seeing them as reliable figures to interact with. And the second point from that answer that I kind of wanted to pick up on was Edward, Prince Edward at that point, later King Edward, a formidable man, king, military leader. And in your book, you use this phrase, he's the last throw of the dice, which I thought was a lovely phrase. Could you kind of unpack that? Why did the Templars see him as that last throw of the dice?
I guess he was, or could have been, the 13th century equivalent of Richard. So he was an English king, or English prince, in line to the throne, who was a natural general. And, the Templars were working with the English crown the whole time. So they knew that he was a good fighter and he was, on their side. So he was somebody, he was a Templar fan. He respected them hugely. And he had, like Richard, the kind of motivation to go out to the East. He was, genuinely pious, genuinely Bolshevik, and genuinely a good general. I mean, it was so from the Templars' perspective, it was fabulous that you could get someone doing that. The trouble was, by the 13th century, as we were saying, the Crusader States are such bit part players that however much Western rulers might want to help, you're kind of throwing, good money after bad. And I think a lot of people, although they would genuinely like to help, there is this underlying reticence because how realistic is it? Are you just delaying the inevitable? And I think the smart money would not be betting on the Crusader States. But to be honest, the smart money would never bet on the Crusader States. But in the 13th century, you really, no gambling man would do that. And so someone like Edward I was wonderful, but it was the last throw. It was the last English king that could put a lot of resource into it. And in fact, Edward did say that he wanted to go back. He did do one rather ineffective. It's quite sad, really. You look at what Edward actually achieved when he went out there, and he was a good military guy, and he had some troops with him. But the troop numbers were so small that they'd train and get ready, and then they'd go out and raid a village, which is probably an ex-Christian village or still a Christian village, and they'd go in there, steal a bit of food, and then they'd dash back before the Muslim armies arrived because they knew that they'd be overwhelmed if they didn't. So it was all a little bit, it was all a bit desperate by then, and the guys, whenever you left the big cities, if you took an English army out of the big cities there was very little upside. The most you could do is wander over and beat up a couple of villages and, burn down a few villages, which had been Christian anyway. And the downside was so huge. The downside was if you got caught, it would be a massacre. Everybody would be overwhelmed. So from a strategic point of view, there's not a lot to be gained in the 13th century, I don't think. And Edward did his best, and he kept saying he'd go back. He always said his heart was in the Holy Land. But the trouble is, by the time, by 1291, the whole of the area had been lost. There wasn't anything to come back to. So however much he liked crusading and liked the Templars, it was just an unwinnable thing at that point.
It's really sad to see an organisation and a leader be able to put their full weight behind something that they truly believed in. They'd organised themselves around for 200 years. And I think that kind of brings us very nicely to Friday the 13th of October, 1307 in France. So why is this date significant, and how does the events surrounding this date affect the British Templars?
Well, this is I think it's the biggest news story of the Middle Ages, really. I mean, it's the biggest headline. It's the ultimate heroes to zeros thing. 12th of October, the Templars are still the poster boys of Christendom. They're the best knights, the most chivalrous knight. They're the kind of the James Bond of the medieval military world. On the 13th of October, they're a bunch of heretical, Satanistic cat bottom lickers, who are on trial, and the whole order is being closed down. So there's this huge swing from one extreme to the other. And but just at the kind of very, very briefly, the French monarchy closed their Templars down. That was the headquarters of the Templar Order. There was a weak pope who they browbeat into letting them do that. But under torture, they either killed Templars or forced them to perjure themselves by agreeing to ridiculous statements about worshipping Satan and being traitors to Christendom and so on. I don't believe any of it. I don't think many people do, really. But this created an awfully difficult situation for the Templars in the other provinces. So in the province of Britain, if you look at say England, Ireland, Scotland, they were people were shocked. And actually, if you look at particularly the English establishment, they and Edward II, who'd just come to the throne then. Edward II is in a very weak position. He's not even been crowned. He's so new on the throne, he hasn't had time to be crowned yet. And here are some of his closest friends and advisors, people that have always been in his royal household. He knew that his dad, rated them incredibly highly, trusted them totally. And suddenly he's being told by the French king, no, sorry, mate, you're wrong. They're all heretics. They worship Satan. I mean, crazy stuff. So instead of closing down the order, you find the English establishment is full of incredulity, really. And Edward II writes to various other monarchs around Europe saying, come on, guys, we can't take this seriously. We've got to, we can't do this. The Templars are great. They've been great friends forever. But eventually, because the papacy is so weak at this point, the English establishment is gradually forced to at least make a show of arresting the Templars. So they're still trusted. You find that they've been arrested at certain points, and then you go back to the records and you find, that actually they're all still living on their estates, or they're riding around on their own horses, or you find the king then sending, as soon as an Inquisition party arrives, the king has to send notes to all the sheriffs saying, do you remember I told you to arrest the Templars? Could you make sure that you actually have arrested them? There's a lot of letters there that are just covering. It's back covering. There's probably, these sheriffs are friendly with the king. The king's probably told them verbally, the Templars are still our friends. Don't worry too much. But then there has to be seen to send out another letter saying, oh yeah, let's arrest them again, because they should have all been under lock and key the whole time anyway. So the English monarchy is very, very slow in arresting the Templars, and the process just grinds on and on. You find that people really don't want to take part. I don't think people really believed it. If you look in Ireland, for instance, the guys were just quietly pensioned off. In fact, there were even English refugee Templars there who nobody bothered to even question. Everybody knew they were there. They were being paid a government pension, so there's no question they were hiding. But they didn't even bother to question them because they just wanted I think they wanted the whole affair to go away. They thought the Templars were innocent. They thought the King of France was greedy, and I think they were right. And they didn't want to do what the King of France was going to tell them to do anyway. I think over the several years that the Templar trials ground on, it became clear that the Templars were redundant. Hard to argue with that, and that their image was so irredeemably spoilt by that point that there wasn't anything left to protect. As an organization, it was the kind of, if we go back to our business case study thing, the reputational damage of their inability to have an adaptive strategy meant that there was nothing left to save. So certainly in England, some of the guys went into hospitaller houses. So in effect, they may have become hospitallers, but there weren't many of them. They were quite old. In reality, most people just got pensioned off. It's a sad ending, but it's not a brutal ending. In France, there was the brutality of murdering, tens and hundreds of people and torturing them. In England and Ireland, and as far as we know in Scotland, we don't know much about Scotland. It was by and large peaceful. Kind of sad that it had to end that way, but the Templars were partly at fault because they hadn't changed themselves. They hadn't adapted in the way that the Hospitallers had.
And like you said, I think more than anything, it is sad, but it's lovely to see that very close relationship with the British monarchy and several British kings does pay dividends towards the end, where it's allowed them to to kind of get away relatively scot-free compared to their French comrades.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. I mean, that it's interesting that when you do hear about Templar Renegades, and I know conspiracists love Templar Renegades because that's how you can create wonderful armies to win Bannockburn and, do crazy stuff like that. But when you do hear of genuine renegades, they're not going to France, which would be the natural place to flee to, because if you get captured in France, you get tortured to death. They tended to escape to either they went to ground with their family, one assumes, tiny numbers, or went to Ireland, where basically the government started paying them, and gave them their pensions. I mean, it's extraordinary, really. So yeah, it is a sad ending. But I think the other thing is that there were structural differences between England and France in the legal systems. In France, they had more of a tradition of dealing with heretics, like the Cathars, and there was an inquisition, and there was more government control over the judiciary, and there was more access to torture. So that's a kind of heady cocktail that if you've got a kind of a more totalitarian bent to your government, those are powerful weapons. And I think that's really what you see in France, is that how it's the impact of torture, really. If you've got a legal system that lets you do it and tortures people, you can get people to say whatever you want. Really, you can. You can torture them until they die, and then what their friends will say, okay, I don't want my bones amputated and burnt off. I'll say whatever you want. Whereas in England, there was no major history of heresy. There was no major tradition of inquisition, and the judiciary was not 100% independent, but it was much more independent. So there were juries. There was no recourse to torture by and large. There may have been a little bit at the end, but by and large, it was a very different system and a very different legal structure. And again, there's something to be proud of as a Brit, actually, in these tough times. That in those situations, there was a better outcome because there were better systems in place.
No, I totally agree with you on that. It is something where we can be quite proud of our legacy of not torturing people as much as possibly the French. So I have a final fun question for you, Steve, as we do for everyone who comes on the podcast. You have written extensively on the Crusades. You've got some amazing books on them. But who is your favourite character from this period?
Wow, that's a good question. I'd have to say it's probably a couple rather than just one, but they're relatives. So if I can extend that with kind of a DNA individual,
Completely fine. Yeah.
I love the early kings of Jerusalem, the Baldwins. Baldwin I, Baldwin II, and Baldwin III. They're all great guys. And again, it comes back to almost your first question, really, which is why do you like these people? And it's because they were poor, permanently in danger, completely stressed, and with a huge burden of responsibility for the communities that they were trying to defend. And I just see these guys getting out of bed every day and onto their horse and doing remarkable things. As I go down the library. So no, I really admire the early kings of Jerusalem and what they achieved, and just how they managed to keep going, in the face of very, very difficult circumstances.
I think that's a fantastic answer. I think, I really feel for those early kings of Jerusalem because they are, like you said, they are in such a difficult position that it doesn't look like there's a lot of ways out. And if you try and take the easy way out, you're going to lose a lot of lives. So I think that's a fantastic answer. Now, obviously, Steve, I've absolutely loved your book, and our listeners are going to want to go away, grab a copy of your book, and interact with you online. So where can they get a copy of your book and find you?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. The Amazon, obviously, or local independent bookshops, which I always love too. Or the Yale website has this is a Yale book, and as of my last two books been, and Yale do make beautiful books. I mean, they're just lovely physical things. So yeah, that's a good port of call. I've got a website called stevetibble.com. Not very imaginative, but does the job. So if you want to get in contact with me and ask a question, please do. If you want to write a review on Amazon, I'd really appreciate that, especially a good one, obviously. But but yeah, no, I try and get on social media quite a bit. I'm on all the usual channels. And so please do get in touch. I try to reply to everyone I can. I'm looking forward to my next book next year as well. But I won't say too much about that. But again, that's going to be with Yale. So and thank you, Jackson. You've been a wonderful host and a great questioner.
Oh, thank you very much, Stephen. I really appreciate that. I enjoyed having you on the podcast, so thank you for coming on.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the History of Jackson podcast. I really hope that you enjoyed listening to Steve talk about his brand new book, Templars, the Knights Who Made Britain. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode or any of the other episodes that we produced here at History of Jackson, please do consider heading to the Buy Me a Coffee profile in the description below, or to History of Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts, where you can support History of Jackson to continue creating the content that we do for you guys on a weekly basis. So in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you all next week, where we have another awesome episode lined up for you guys to learn more history from.